Welcome, everyone. We're going to be getting started in just a few minutes.
I'm not introducing them.
Hello, this is Wahida. Listeners.
Hi, Wahida. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a minute or so. It's just 10 o'clock now.
Nana was asking that I send her a link. Did she get it? Cause
I got it. Thank you.
Great. Okay. All right. I'm going back on mute.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our PWN Policy 101 webinar. We're so glad you could all join us today. This is Nana Khanna, Executive Director of Positive Women's Network USA, and I just wanted to formally welcome you all and also give you a little bit of logistical information. So just so you know, this webinar is being recorded, and also everybody's phone is by default on mute except the presenters. You can unmute yourself by pressing *6 at any time. So that's just to reduce background noise, although we unfortunately have a jackhammer going outside our office today. So we're going to be on mute when we're not speaking as well. But that's what you might be hearing in the background here. So we're so glad all of you could be here today, and we're really excited to be launching this webinar series. This is our first in a series of policy skills building webinars designed for women living with HIV. And as you all know, it's a big part of our mission to bring women living with HIV reflective of the constituencies most impacted into the policy and decision-making processes. So making sure that we understand, exactly how policies work, how policies get made, who makes decisions about what, how we can impact that, and how we can sit at those tables and become decision makers. And so we're hoping that this series of webinars that's been put together for you by the fabulous Arnita Rogers and some other folks is going to help lay the groundwork for that. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters. We have 3 fabulous, fantastic presenters for you today. Arnita Rogers, our Law Students for Reproductive Justice Fellow, who works at the intersection of HIV and reproductive justice at Positive Women's Network USA, is going to be kind of leading this webinar and is actually leading the production of this skills building series. So really glad to be able to have her guiding this process with her expertise. And then we also have Candace Bon-Thoreau from the National LGBTQ Task Force, as well as Zaya Bomani from the National LGBTQ Task Force, who are going to be bringing a lot of expertise with the work the task force does on working with policy decision makers. And so we want to encourage you all to feel free to type in your comments and questions on the chat box throughout the webinar. And also, you can also just say in the chat box, I have a question, and we'll try to pay attention to that, because I think we'll have time at various points sort of throughout the webinar where we can stop and you can unmute yourself to ask something if you want to. And then there will also be time at the end for discussion and questions. But we want this to be as interactive as possible, and we want to really hear from you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Arnita, who's going to lead us through an introduction here.
Great. Thank you so much, Nana. As Nana was saying, this is going to be the first webinar in a series built on developing skills and capacity to do policy and advocacy work. So we're really excited to be rolling this out today and hope that you all can join us for our next 2 webinars in the series, because they will really build off one another as the series goes on. So once again, I'm Arnita Rogers, and I'll be joined by Candace Bon-Thoreau and Zaya Bomani from the LGBTQ Task Force. All right. So our webinar objectives for today are to have participants be able to learn to identify federal agencies where federal policy is administered. We also hope to increase your understanding of the federal legislative policymaking process and help you to learn to identify key policymakers to target for your advocacy efforts. And then so I'll also say that most of the content of this webinar will be focused at policymaking at the federal level, but along the way we'll include some parallels to the state legislative process, because that is a lot of the work that PWN chapters do, but here at the national office we're focused on doing federal work so that we can demonstrate how those things happen at the state level too. Okay, so as Nana was saying in her introduction, the reason that we are rolling out these skills building webinars is MIPA. We want the meaningful involvement of women living with HIV, and part of PWN's mission is to prepare and involve women living with HIV in all of their diversity, including gender, identity, and sexual expression in all levels of policy and decision making. And part of the process of preparing is being familiar with the policy making process and having folks be comfortable with the actual process, who to target, what are the federal agencies that are responsible for administering policies related to HIV, and at the intersection of reproductive justice and other issues, and who are the targets, who are the policymakers that are making all of these things happen. And then so you see I have a picture here on the side of a dinner table. And so our regional organizing director, Wahida Shabazz, always says that if you're not at the table, then you'll find yourself on the menu. So this is what MIPA is about. And so these are the skills that we're trying to build. Okay, and so just as an overview, this is under the umbrella of PWN USA policy priorities. We have 6 policy priorities that we direct most of our work around, our policy and advocacy work around. Hopefully that most folks on this webinar are familiar with these 6 policy priorities. As they relate to one another, most of them are, intersectional. They overlap and aren't really separated, but under this umbrella you can see what they are. And I'll just list them here quickly. We have ending HIV-related criminalization, ending violence against women and girls, HIV prevention justice, economic justice, women-centered care, and sexual and reproductive rights and justice. And so if you would like to find out more information about any of these 6 policy priorities, I encourage you to check out any of the number of resources that we have available on the PWN website. We have fact sheets that actually go into context and background for each of these 6 policy priorities, as well as policy recommendations about what we advocate here for at the national level, and hope that our members and our broader advocacy community will join us in advocating for around some policy and advocacy change around these issues. Also, as we go along through this training, we'll talk about specific policies, and I encourage you to think about how the policies that we discuss, and as we talk about the process, how they might fit into some of these categories under the umbrella. Think about how they might fall into sexual and reproductive rights and justice, or ending HIV-related criminalization, or women-centered care. All right, so I'll be starting off our presentation, or the actual skills building part of our presentation, by providing an overview of some key federal agencies that are pretty integral in HIV-related policy and advocacy work. Okay, and so before we get going into discussion of these federal agencies, it's important to understand the sources of federal power. So here we have a very, it's a very basic illustration of our 3 branches of government, which we have the legislative branch, which is Congress, who are charged with making the laws that we abide by, and that's separated into the House of Representatives and, of course, the Senate. The executive branch, which we find president and vice president under, and then I'll later go into a discussion about federal agencies, which also fall under the purview of the executive branch. And then on the far right here, we have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, which we know that we have a vacancy on the Supreme Court right now, that we are in a battle of seeing whether we're going to get a nomination, or if the Congress in their legislative capacity will initiate the process for replacement for Justice Scalia, who passed about a month ago. Okay, so as I talk about the federal agencies, I mentioned that the federal agencies generally fall under the purview of the president as the executive branch. So under the executive branch of government is charged with executing the laws. And so the federal agencies have a role to play, but also some of those laws can be executed through the cabinet of the president. So the cabinet is made up of various offices regarding domestic and international policy that the president has advisors on that advise him on a number of different policy issues. So specifically, an office that you as advocates may have heard of or hear reference to frequently is ONAP. This is the Office of National AIDS Policy. And so this falls directly under President Obama right now. You see here on the diagram, we have the executive branch, and then there's an arrow to the Domestic Policy Council, which has a number of different offices dealing with various domestic policy issues. And under that falls ONAP, the Office of National AIDS Policy. And so we now, Dr. Amy Lansky has just stepped into an interim position of leadership over the Office of National AIDS Policy, which is a position formerly held by Douglas Brooks, which was just vacated, I think, just a few days ago, earlier this week. What's important to note is that ONAP is the office that is responsible for creating the National HIV and AIDS Strategy for the United States. So this is work that, as advocates, PWN, in our community, we did a lot of work around the indicators and advising how the strategy could be most impactful for women living with HIV and other marginalized communities that needed more representation in the strategy. So it's important to note that the National HIV and AIDS Strategy was developed under the executive branch. This was not an act of Congress. Okay. All right, and so another federal agency that you likely have heard a lot about, or that we talk a lot about in doing policy and advocacy work related to HIV advocacy, is the Department of Health and Human Services. So this is one of the major health agencies tasked with delivering a myriad of health services for people throughout the country. So this, it's important to note that, like I said, this is an agency that falls under the purview of the president, as he is tasked with executing the role of the Health and Human Services. He personally will appoint leadership over the various agencies that fall under the Department of Health and Human Services. It's also important to note that it's Congress who funds the various agencies under the Health and Human Services Department. So where, through a process called appropriation. So where the president, has the ability to, task these agencies to do something, it's Congress who we also need to target to make the available funds to appropriately see those implementations in place. All right, so this is kind of more of a schematic. This is a more detailed version of, the full organizational chart of the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, as you might have heard it called. And I want to highlight the agencies where we mostly do our advocacy around. So here you have the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which they do most of the data collection around surveillance around the HIV epidemic. The National Institutes of Health, you might hear about them in the context of doing research or in clinical trials, or developing vaccines, or but that's the major research body that falls under the Department of Health and Human Services. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid, or CMS, as you might hear it called for short. You could guess that they are tasked with administering Medicare and Medicaid, for whom a large portion of people living with HIV rely on in some capacity, and so it's important to understand how our advocacy relates to CMS as well. And then, of course, the Health Resources and Service Administration, which is called HRSA for short. And so the web keeps getting deeper and deeper, as you see. On this slide, we have the Health Resources and Services Administration, and / HIV/AIDS Bureau, HAB is what we call it for short. So you can see we start off at the top with, from the last slide of having the Department of Health and Human Services fall under the purview of the president, and then to various agencies that split to the Health Resource and Service Administration, and then finally down to HAB. So I just want to note, we have a picture here of Dr. Laura Cheever, who is the administrator for the HIV and AIDS Bureau, HAB. And HAB is the main administrator for the Ryan White AIDS program, which we know is the largest federal program exclusively on HIV and AIDS care. And so it's not particularly important to memorize these various agencies that fall underneath HRSA, then HAB. But as we know, the Ryan White program is split into different parts, of which are the levels of funding are directed at. So Part A funding primarily is directed at the Division of Metropolitan HIV and AIDS programs. The Division of State and HIV and AIDS programs directly gets Part B funding, and Division of Community HIV and AIDS programs primarily gets Part C and Part D funding, for which provides services and supportive services for women living with HIV, and a lot of what our advocacy work centers around. All right, so this is just to see if you are picking up what we're putting down. We've got our first polling question, and you can, if you're following along or on the webinar, you can engage. So let's see if I can do this. Okay, I'm starting voting now. So, I'll give you 30 more seconds. Okay, great. Stop and voting, but it looks like we are 100%. So you're right. It's the executive branch that is responsible for creating the National HIV and AIDS Strategy. And through that National HIV and AIDS Strategy, of course, there are many indicators and directives for those federal agencies, HRSA, HHS, and the CDC to do things, to collect data, to establish programs that we will all be advocating around in the coming years, months, days. Okay. So without further ado, we're going to kind of shift gears here. This is where I was talking about, the federal agencies and what we call in our advocacy around the federal agencies, most often called administrative advocacy. We're going to shift gears and talking about federal legislative advocacy. So this is advocacy or the policy process and advocacy that's done through Congress and focusing on how a bill becomes a law. And so I will turn it over to my fabulous colleague, Candace Bonzaro, who is going to be taking on this section. Candace, are you there? It's *6 to unmute if you're on mute.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here via the virtual world with you. My name is Candace Bontario, and I am the Policy Counsel for Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice at the National LGBTQ Task Force. And so what I'm basically really going to start off with is where the legislature actually gets its power to do what it does, and it's from Article 1, Section 1 of the United States Constitution, which grants the legislative branch its power to actually make laws. And I'm just going to do a really quick overview, and there will be a polling question at some point in my presentation. So we'll just kick things off. First, as everyone I'm sure knows, there are two different houses. There's the Senate, which is made up of 100 senators. There are 2 from every state. And then there's also the House of Representatives, which is made up of 435 members. And those House of Representative members are determined based on the population size of a particular state. And right now we're at 435. And the House and Senate procedures are generally the same. There are some technical differences with voting and how to bring a bill to the floor and how to move that process along. So there are technical differences, but I'm just really going to highlight the overview for the purposes of this presentation. And both houses can pretty much bring whatever bill they would like to, with a few exceptions. The House, all revenue and appropriations bills, which Arnita was speaking about earlier, have to start in the House. So the appropriation process has to start in the House, which is really important to know because those are the members that need to be targeted when dealing with the fiscal revenue and the budget. So various government programs are all started with the House determining how much money each federal program for the Health and Human Services Department and Department of Labor, all administrative agencies, those are all started with the House. And in the Senate is the only body that can confirm any of the presidential appointments, which Arnita spoke about for a second earlier too. So the SCOTUS nomination, the Supreme Court nomination that's happening right now, the process has to be in the Senate, and the Senate is also in charge of any foreign relations or treaties. And right now, the Speaker of the House, who pretty much is the highest appointed person in the House, is Paul Ryan, and the Majority Leader in the Senate is Mitch McConnell. And so I have a chart, if everyone can see it, of how a bill becomes a law. And if you notice, both sides are pretty identical, depending on which side a bill starts with. But the most important thing that I consider in the legislative process is that a bill is really just started from an idea, whether it's an idea by a member of Congress or a committee or an advocacy group or a group of just Americans or citizens. It could be non-citizens, so just a group of people, advocates, like the Positive Women's Network could get together and come up with an idea for a great piece of legislation, a great piece of policy. And what you would do is you would take that idea to either a member's office, like a member of Congress, to their office, or a committee office, and it would go through a drafting process. So the bill would be drafted. Various lawyers that are hired by those committees would go through the technical language and figure out the best way to craft and draft this bill. And then once that's all done, which usually takes quite a while, it will be introduced. And it can be introduced in the House. Any member can introduce a bill, and what they do is they place it into this wooden box called the hopper, and that means that it's officially introduced, and then it goes through printing, and then it gets a bill name or a bill number, and that's pretty much all that needs to happen. And then in the Senate, a bill is just presented to the clerk of the Senate, who will then give the bill a number. And then, so once it's introduced in the House, it will be designated or referred to a committee. So sometimes, depending on what the bill is, the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader in the Senate will get to determine which committees will get to look at the bill and decide the language of the bill. So there are a large number of committees on both sides. For instance, there's the Senate Judiciary Committee, which handles nominations. So that's the committee everyone is looking at right now in order to get them and pressure them to schedule a hearing to hear Judge Merrick Garland. So that is the committee that is responsible for that. And within these committees, there are also subcommittees that might have a specific responsibility or nuance or expertise in a particular area that's under that committee's jurisdiction. So sometimes the bill goes straight to committee itself, or sometimes it has to go through a deeper step and goes to the subcommittee. And then in the subcommittee, it's discussed. The subcommittee members come to a vote. They vote on the bill. If it passes a simple majority, which is just 51%, then it goes to the committee itself. And then the committee itself has the option of holding a hearing where they'll bring in experts on that particular issue, or other types of people that maybe people that are in complete opposition to the bill, to kind of hear both sides. They're not required to have a hearing, but usually on really controversial pieces of legislation, they'll hold a hearing. Once the hearing happens, then the bill will go to markup, and that is when there will be further discussion amongst committee members and the legislative council or lawyers in their committees to determine the best draft version. So it goes through a whole redrafting process, and then once that's done, then and only then can the full committee vote on the bill. But the full committee can only vote on the bill if the chair of the committee, who is, and every committee is chaired by one person, has to bring the bill to a vote. So there are a lot of different ways that a bill can pretty much just not make it through the process, because it depends, a lot of our legislative process really depends on certain players and certain people. So that's why the speaker, the chair of a committee and the speaker of the House have such big influence, because legislation won't make it to the floor of the entire body unless they give the go-ahead. So once it gets through committee and it's voted on, there's a positive vote in committee, then it goes to the entire House floor. And all members of the House of Representatives are able to vote on it. Usually in the House, they do a lot of votes by voice, which really just means everyone says yay or nay, and the yays have it or the nays have it. They also have an electronic voting process in the House, since there are so many of them. And then if a bill gets the go-ahead and passes that majority, then it will be sent to the Senate. And then in the Senate, they will start by just taking it to the Senate floor itself. And they can also, the Senate has the option of sending it down to one of its committees to work on drafting if the language is not something that they would approve of. So then it becomes this back and forth game of drafting and language and very technical issues about amendments, and amendments are added, and it's a very, very long, arduous process. And if it goes past, so if the House votes on it and votes yes, and then it goes to the Senate, discussions are happening, it gets a yes vote, then it gets sent to the President, and the President has the option to either sign the bill into law or to veto it. And it's really difficult to override a president's veto, since you have to have a supermajority in both houses. So members will really only send a bill to the president's desk if they know that it's going to be signed into law, or they're just doing it for messaging purposes, even if they know it's going to get vetoed. So that, in a very short, fast-paced nutshell, is the process of how a bill becomes law. So the next chart, or the next slide, is on the Each Woman Act. So the Each Woman Act is actually called the Equal Access to Abortion Coverage and Health Insurance Act, and it's Each Woman Act for short, even though it doesn't necessarily make up the word each, but I mean, just work with it. So that's what it's called. And this is a piece of legislation that was introduced last July by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who is one of my favorite congresswomen. And this bill is a direct reaction, and it's trying to repeal the Hyde Amendment. And the Hyde Amendment is an amendment that was passed in 1976 by Henry Hyde that pretty much bans federal funding for abortion, except in cases of rape, incest, or life endangerment. And this is part of the appropriations process. So it's passed every year. It's just rolled into the annual appropriations process. So this bill is trying to take it out of that process and trying to or directly get rid of this provision. And this provision has two basic tenets. First, the bill respects that every woman should be able to make her own decisions about pregnancy. And second, if a woman gets her care or insurance through the federal government, she will be covered for all pregnancy-related care in abortion care. So those are the two big tenets of the Each Woman Act. And this would affect a large number of people. Once the bill hopefully becomes law, it would ensure that a lot more women and other people who can get pregnant will have the opportunity to seek abortion without having a huge financial hardship. So this bill was introduced with 3 original co-sponsors, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, and Congresswoman Diane DeGeet. And when it was originally introduced, there were 70 co-sponsors in the House, which means that 70 other members were really excited and fully supportive of the bill and signed on. And as of yesterday, the last time that I checked, the number of co-sponsors has increased from 70 to 116, which just goes to show that legislation is a really long process and slow. And it's been about 8 months, I believe, and we have gotten 46 more co-sponsors, which is actually a really big deal. So right now, the bill has been introduced, it's been sent to committee, and as of now, the advocacy groups are really just trying to whip votes and get more co-sponsors to sign on to the bill before asking for a committee hearing. So the next step in the process would be for one of the committees, probably the Health Committee, to have a hearing. But it doesn't make sense to hold a hearing until you kind of know that you will at least have a large number of people on that committee that will vote in favor of your bill in order to vote it out of committee. So we're kind of in a waiting period right now of waiting to get more co-sponsors. And the task force is a member of a coalition called All Above All, where this is the primary focus of All Above All, is to repeal the Hyde Amendment and to put this piece of proactive legislation into law. So that was the Each Woman Act, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that later in the discussion. And I also have provided resources throughout my PowerPoint on how to find out more information about the Each Woman Act and just more information in general about the legislative process. And the last thing that I wanted to really note is, to the resources, the Library of Congress and Congress.gov are amazing resources if you want general and really detailed information about the legislative process. You can go into both of those websites and go into resources section, and you can learn probably more than you ever wanted to learn about the legislative process. And it's really, really interesting. You can also learn about the appropriations process, and you can track bills. You can track the appropriations process for this year as it's happening, but you can also see what's happened in the past. I think they have the appropriations processes from at least the past 15 years. So it's a really great resource. But as I was going to say, the last thing I want to say is I know that a lot of the people on this call are members of state governments and work closely with their state legislatures, and I just wanted to highlight the fact that I talked specifically about the federal legislative process and not a particular state, because state processes are all very different, and states are able to create their own legislative process based on the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And in general, most state legislatures mirror the federal process, where you have a legislative branch, you have an executive branch where the governor sits, and then you have a state court system. And even smaller than that, there's also city governments and municipal governments, which also mirror the state process and also mirror the federal process. And that's where you have the mayor, who sits in the executive chair, and then the city council. So all three layers are extremely important, and you can go onto your state and city website to find out information about each of those processes and how you can become an advocate at the various levels of government, because every level is extremely important, and especially the city government, the city council level. So I really encourage everyone to do a little bit of research on their particular state and municipality so you can get tapped into that work. And yeah, that's pretty much all that I have. And I'm going to pass it on to my polling question. So the question is, where in the legislative process is the Each Woman Act? And the choices are we at the idea phase? Are we at the introduction in the House phase? Are we at committee markup? Or have we had a committee vote? Give it a few more seconds. Okay, so I have 66% say that we are at the introduction in the House process, and that is correct. We are really at the beginning. So there's a lot of work that can be done and a lot of ways to plug in your voices to this process. Please contact your member of Congress if they've not signed on to the bill, and you can find out if your member has signed on to the bill by going to congress.gov, and I can give you the bill number. It is HR 2972. So then you can see if your member has signed on to the bill, and if they have not, you can write them a letter. You can talk to me. I'm happy to help with anyone who is interested in making sure that their member is on the bill. And your members actually really love to hear from you. They love their constituents, and you have a lot more power than I think that people know, because their constituents will open the door for their constituents before they open their door for a lot of people. So I would definitely use that power to your advantage. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Candace. You laid laid a foundation for a lot of what I'm going to cover. And thank you all again for showing up virtually for today's webinar. I'm watching the comments, and it sounds like people are getting a lot out of it so far. So I hope I can continue that great trend. Again, my name is Zaya Bomani, and I'm Arnita's equivalent, the LSRJ Fellow here at the National LGBTQ Task Force. So I'm going to talk to you today about how you identify and engage the players or the policymakers to advance your advocacy goals. And so I've sort of broken it out into the conventional who, what, where, why, how, starting with the what. You want to know what your goals are and be concrete about that. And that will help you determine how you end up identifying who you need to contact and how you will engage them. So once you know what your goal is, then you determine what level of government you're going to address, whether it's the federal, the state, or the municipal, as Candace had mentioned. And then identify who you need to contact and why them specifically. And then finally, you can strategize on how you're going to engage the policymakers. So there are two main ways I would say that you can create change. And so you can either A, have a piece of draft legislation, as Candace went over. You start out at the beginning, you have a bill that's ready to go, like the Each Woman Act or the Repeal HIV Discrimination Act, which again is sponsored by Congresswoman, or it was introduced by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who does great work. And almost so many of the progressive bills are often authored by her. And in fact, when someone says, oh, this piece of legislation or this bill was introduced or authored by a certain representative, quite often they aren't actually the ones who are physically sitting down at their desk writing up these bills. They're often interest groups or advocacy organizations or coalitions who come together and actually write the legislation and then present it to a congressperson and say, hey, we'd really like you to be behind this bill. Could you be the one to introduce it and have your name behind it? So sitting down and drafting a law is pretty hard work. It takes a lot of resources to do that. So not everyone has the ability to actually present that kind of a policy change. So another way you can do that is you actually have specific policy concerns or ideas, and you need someone who is going to be a champion for, or who's going to present that as part of their own agenda and be the one to create the change that you want to see. So I'm going to use the example of just criminalization of HIV. So there's specifically the right to work. So let's say you want to raise awareness of the fact that employers often require convicted felons to disclose their conviction when they apply for jobs. And then people who may have been who have been convicted under HIV exposure and transmission laws are now forced to disclose their status. And you want to raise awareness of that issue, let's say. And so you might say you want to have a ban the box initiative or a fair chance policy initiative. You don't want to sit down and write the draft of the bill, but you want to get enough awareness around the issue so that someone, an organization or an advocacy group that has more legal expertise can actually write that bill. But you have to get to the point where people think it's important enough to do that. So let's say that's your goal. You want to just raise awareness of an issue. Knowing what your goals are will help you then figure out who you need to contact and how you'll present your case to them, which is the second step. Where in Congress or in the state legislature or at your local level, where are you going to affect the change that you want to see? As Candace mentioned, municipal levels, that's like your city council, your mayor. You have the state and federal versions are pretty much identical for the most part. And yes, even the international level, you can do a lot of you can help bring awareness to issues like the UN. Flint, some activists from Flint went to the UN earlier this month or last month to raise the fact that the water crisis they're experiencing is a violation of their human rights and bring it up to an international level. You can do a lot of great work at the local level and make a lot of great progressive change. Maybe you have a good relationship with your city council members so you can actually pass some laws. And remember, the higher up you go, the harder it is to make change. So as Candace mentioned, the Each Woman Act had, started off with 70 co-sponsors, and we're still at the very beginning of the process. It takes a long time to do it, and it's really hard to make change at the national level. So sometimes you might consider going locally or at the state level because you might have more traction there. So if you were using the ban the box example that I gave to end the sort of discrimination in employment for HIV-positive folk, let's say you want to target your city government agencies and public hiring practices so that employers, public employment applicants, or someone who is a city contractor and wants to hire from the general population, you could say, hey, we want you to create a law or a policy that says we're not going to ask this question on our application process. So once you've identified who or the where and what level of Congress you're going to be talking to, what level of government you want to be speaking to, you want to figure out who in that level is the appropriate person to contact. So as Candace laid out, you have the executive, judicial, legislative branches. If you're looking at the municipal level, you have your city council, who's kind of like your representatives, and then the mayor is almost like the executive. And the state level, you have Congress, with the two houses, and the governor, and then the same with federal. You have the two houses, and then the president. So you want to know, once you find out who you contact within that level, you have to think about why you're contacting them. Think about who has the power to influence others, who has the power to enact your policy idea. Maybe you have a great working relationship with a city council member, but maybe they're the most junior member of the council. No one listens to them or what have you. You know, you have to think about the relationship and the dynamics within the level of government that you're going to be talking to. And I can give in the comments some resources of how you find out who your representatives are. The federal level is kind of easy because the system works for everybody. State levels, finding out who your state senator and your state congressperson is. Usually your state will have a website where you can look that up based on the district or wherever you live within your state. And then same with the city. If you want to find out who your what district you live in and then who your city council member is that represents you, that varies city by city, but usually the city website or your state website will have information on how to look up who your representatives are so you know who to contact them. As Candace mentioned, you know, when you're dealing with actual legislation, it has to go through committees before it goes through the various iterations. So you want to know the committees that your representatives serve on. Maybe you're trying to pass the Ban the Box initiative, and there's somebody in your state government who is on the head of employment and development. That would be the Employment and Development Committee. That would be the great person to contact because they are a head or chair of an area of expertise that is relevant to the bill that you want to pass. And once you know who you contact, well, in the next slide I'm going to talk more about how you contact them. So there's different ways that you can contact: phone, in-district visits, testimony, so on and so forth. So strategizing how you engage them. You want to know what other initiatives have worked in the past in the area that you're working on, and whether they've failed as well. So what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. That would be a really great way to gauge how you should interact with your congressperson or your senator or your city council member or your mayor or whoever you're deciding to target. You also want to think about the form of contact that your policymaker best responds to. If you're talking about city council members, they often have hearings, public hearings and meetings, which are open to the public. That'd be a great opportunity to have testimony where people, women living with HIV, can come and actually testify and say, hey, this question that you keep asking, have you been convicted, hurts me and my family because I was convicted under HIV transmission and exposure laws, and now I can't get a job working here in my own community and put food on the table for my kids. And having something like that, if that's what your city council member best responds to, would be incredibly powerful. Sometimes you want to go with letters or petitions, right? You want to mobilize your community to send a bunch of letters or petitions asking the mayor or your senator or whoever to move in a certain direction on a piece of legislation or bring awareness to a specific issue. That was, like I said, a really quick overview of how you engage players. It's hard because at the federal level, there's one way of doing it, and each level of government has its own form of engagement, so to speak. Going and talking to the president is not quite as easy to walk up into the White House, but there is, under President Obama's administration, to his credit, he has created this petitions, I think it's petition.gov, where you can actually propose an idea or an issue or a concern of yours, and after I think the threshold is 200,000 votes or so, it will be taken into consideration by the administration. So depending on the level of government that you plan on targeting, you'll have to adjust your strategy of who specifically you're going to target within that level, and then how best to engage them. I mentioned the Ban the Box. If anyone's interested, I can let me copy and paste that and plug that into the comments. Ban the Box is an initiative that many people can engage in. If you don't feel like you have the capacity to write a bill on your own, as I said, you can raise awareness of an issue or join and be part of a coalition that's already underway that has people who've already written draft legislation like the Each Woman Act or the Repeal Act or various other legislation that is floating out there that needs the traction, and having grassroots organizations and advocacy groups to help push that forward would be better than trying to recreate the wheel on your own as a small individual or a group. So that's the ban the box. And I'll also put the link in for how to find out your representative in Congress at the federal level. And then I will also put up the poll question. Let's see if I can do this. So the question is, if you want to pass legislation in your city, who's the best policymaker you should target and why? So option 1, or the first one, is your senior city council member X, because you have a good working relationship with them. Second one, the governor, because he or she is in charge of the entire state. 3, the president, because he's the ultimate authority in the U.S., or the UN, because this issue is a human rights issue. So remember, the question is, you want to pass legislation in your city. Who do you want to target and why? I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, so well, it's just still coming in, but I think everyone can see the results. It's the first question. You know, in theory, it's not a bad idea to talk to the UN or the president or what have you, but because I specifically said your goal is to pass legislation, you want to always make the best use of your time. And so if you want to pass legislation in your city, going to the UN to talk about it probably isn't the best thing. Yes, it is a human rights issue, but you know, if you already have a senior council member that you've worked with in the past, maybe you actually pass legislation through the senior city council member before. That would be the best place to start off and work through the process of getting that legislation all the way through. So that's it for my section. I guess we can open it up to questions for everybody from the audience members.
Great. Thank you so much, Zaya. That was a really fabulous presentation. If you have any questions for me or Candace or Zaya, you can press *6 to unmute your line, I believe, and we have a few minutes if you have any questions, or also in the chat box. We've gotten some really great comments and questions in the chat box along the way, so really great participation. Okay, I think I see. Sarah, I didn't get the tail end of your question. You said, how would you go about getting the... And then, Kamaria, I have, will any of this be presented at HIV is not a crime? And this particular presentation won't be presented at HIV is not a crime, but there will be a lot of skill building sessions that, you know, go through the policymaking process as it relates to HIV decriminalization laws presented there. This presentation will be available on our website, so you can use it in your chapters. It's been recorded so that you can come back and reference the specific points that Zaya and Candace made along the way. They provided really great presentations. So please feel free to come back and use this as a resource. It'll be on the CWN website. Okay, great. Zaya or Candace, did you have any final comments or anything you want to add to close?
I think I do see the second half of Sarah Jackson's question.
Oh,
So
sure.
yeah. How would you go about getting homeless women and HIV help? I'm thinking that's the question.
Great question.
Yeah, so like I said, the more concrete of your goal, the easier it is to figure out how to go about doing it. If you said, I want to end HIV, or I want to end world hunger, I want to end poverty, those are really big and hard and very important goals, and very hard. So if you had something specifically like, I want to ensure that women living with HIV who are homeless have shelter in the wintertime or something like that, then you've sort of made it a little bit more concrete. Shelters, wintertime, that might be something that's maybe at the local or state level, and working with like the housing agency, or working with other coalitions who work on homelessness and economic justice, and you can build a consensus around that and maybe tie that issue into a bigger coalition movement. So it's hard to say, like, how do you help homeless women or women living with HIV without knowing specifically what you want to help them with. So figuring out what area in your life you'd like to have an improvement. Everything, obviously, but you want to do one step at a time. Do great on one area and then move on to the next, so then you can, at the end, have a holistic solution that works for everybody. Oh, finding housing is the question. How to help homeless women, HIV-positive women with finding housing. So again, I can't speak for what happens in every city or state, but I would assume like the housing department, there are initiatives, I think there are local initiatives as well as, Candace, do you know if like HUD or anyone works on a national level helping people, homeless people find shelter or helping people find homes?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I believe that HUD does. I don't know specifically. I would have to ask our colleague Megan about that, since she does a lot of the economic justice work with HUD.
Yeah, well, I'm glad everyone's asking these great questions, because it means you have ideas brewing. This was a really, really basic overview, just so people know how these processes work. I'd be happy, and I think Candace too would be happy to follow up with specific questions, and we can maybe connect you to resources or people.
For sure. Thank you both. And, we're going to be doing some trainings and campaign development work with some of the chapters, including in Louisiana, Sarah. So if this is an issue that your chapter is interested in working on as an economic justice and reproductive justice issue, that's something that we can identify and help you guys develop a targeted campaign around. But again, so I want to thank my awesome co-presenters for joining this. I think you guys can agree they did a really great job of explaining this sometimes overcomplicated process in a very clear way, and this can be used as a resource for us going forward. So thank you guys for joining. I put our contact information up here, all of our email addresses. If you want to reach out after this is over, or talk about things specifically with either Zare, Candace, or I. And also a save the date for our next skills building webinar. This is going to be a follow-up to this webinar and build on some of the things we talked about with the process and talk about policy analysis. So this is going to be Policy Analysis 101, and this is going to be a digger deep into how policies impact us, looking at the consequences of policy and either the intended consequences or the unintended consequences of laws that shape the way we live. So looking forward to that. That's going to be on Wednesday, April 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and the registration is included on the PowerPoint here. And so this will be up on the PWN website, and feel free to use it over and over again. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Yes. Okay.